Thank you. So everybody, Temple McKinnon is, as you can see, the director of the water supply planning at the Texas Water Development Board. And Temple has about 27 years of experience. And she's going to talk tonight about the 2022 Texas State Water Plan, which looks out 50 years into the future. And I think you'll find some quite surprising things from listening to this talk about where and how we're going to get water in Texas for the next 50 years. So with that, I'll ask everybody to mute and hand over to Temple. Thank you, Temple.
All right, well, thanks, John, for inviting me this evening. It's been nice to meet and chat with you all. Thanks for taking the time this evening to learn about what we do at the state. I'm going to give a brief background on the planning process in Texas, just not assume that y'all are aware that it exists or how it works. And I'm going to give some illustrative examples of some of the water use categories that we plan for that I think would be of interest to this audience, seeing as we're all geoscientists. I was going to focus on the groundwater aspects in our planning process and then provide an overview of the findings of the 2022 State Water Plan. And I'm game to take questions along the way. I don't know how y'all prefer it, or if you want to wait till the end. John, I guess I'll let you direct that traffic. So just start, yeah.
To the end, I think.
Okay, you bet. All right, so our agency, the Texas Water Development Board, was created in 1957 following a pretty significant 7-year drought across the state. We were tasked with planning for the state's water supply needs should a drought of that magnitude recur again. And we were also given bonding authority for water infrastructure financing. So our agency is pretty interesting. It's a smaller agency for our state. Half of it's a bank. 25% of it is planning for both flood planning and water supply planning. And then there's a water science and conservation office who, they collect scientific data and provide studies for public use. States developed these plans since the 1950s. And in 1997, the legislature shifted the process to a bottoms-up process that came from the regional areas of the state. And this approach, I think, has produced some more credible plans because it's based upon local planning efforts by the water utilities that are actually planning and implementing projects to address drought supply needs. So the purpose of these plans are based on conditions that would exist if we had a recurrence of the worst recorded drought in history. We call that the drought of record. And I emphasize that just because it is drought supply planning we do. It's not, like average daily use planning that utilities have to do. So there is that distinction. Drought of record is a time when generally water supplies are lowest and water demands are the highest. And so for most of the state, this still does remain the period between 1950 and 1957. But the drought of the 2010s also marked new records for several basins across the state, mainly the Colorado Basin and then the Sulphur Basin up in Northeast Texas, to name a few. 2011 remains the representative dry year condition for many of the water demand projections in the 2022 State Water Plan. A dry year condition, that's just a representative condition upon which we develop plans for drought of record. And then the drought response information is included in each of the regional water plans, and along with each region's recommendation to the state's Drought Preparedness Council, we summarized all that information in the drought chapter of the State Water Plan. So this map shows the 16 regional water planning areas across the state, and there's a planning group for each of those areas. Membership of those groups is composed of the 12 interest groups you see here. Those are established in water code, so by statute, along with the agencies that are named by statute as participants on the right of the slide. So those acronyms stand for Texas Water Development Board, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas Department of Agriculture, and the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, is also a non-voting member in several regions Each of these regions has the ability to add membership categories as they deem appropriate. So for example, down in the Rio Grande, where you have water master issues that deal with water delivery, that's run by the TCQ. They added TCQ as a non-voting member to their group to bring information for them to consider. So these voting interests represent almost 3,000 discrete entities that we plan for in the state water plan statewide. And all of that happens through a regional process. And our board is required to revisit the boundaries that you see here and our planning guidance principles every 5 years. The planning boundaries that you see here, they were reconfirmed by our board in February of last year. And we're currently in the process of reviewing comments on a draft rule package that we received comments on for our planning guidance principles review. So how do we plan? There's of those 3,000 discrete water users I mentioned, they fall across the 6 categories of use that you see on the left-hand side of that slide. So municipal use, that includes both urban and rural areas of the state, irrigated agriculture, water used in the production of various types of livestock. So cattle, poultry, hogs, horses, sheep, goats. We look at water used in the exploration, development, and extraction of mined resources, manufacturing water necessary for large facilities, and then steam electric power generation. So our agency works with the state demographer and state resource agencies, and we develop draft population and water demand projections for each of those water use categories for the 50-year planning horizon, like John mentioned. And when we release those draft demands, the planning groups get to review that information, and they bring locally available information they may have to request revisions to those water demands. And then our board adopts the final projections that become the basis for the regional plans and the state water plan. So regional water planning groups compare existing water supplies with current and projected water demands to identify when and where additional water supplies are needed for water user groups and the major water providers across the state. Planning groups identify water user groups that will not have enough water during times of drought, and then they recommend strategies that could be implemented to address potential shortages, and they estimate the costs of what those strategies or projects will be. So all the while, they're providing data that supports the development of the state water plan in these efforts. But there are some instances where no economically feasible water supply could be identified, and that's most prevalent with agricultural water users. And I'll show that in a little more detail later on in this presentation. So every 5 years, our board must develop and adopt a comprehensive state water plan, and it is based upon those 16 regional plans. During the draft plans, each planning group submits them to our agency, and so to facilitate public review and public comment, we provided an interactive platform of their draft data, similar to an interactive state water plan that we host. And we display the draft data in those plans. Public hearings are then held by each of those planning groups, and comments have to be addressed prior to submitting their final plans to our agency. Then our board approves their plans, and that was done in January of 2021. And then following a public comment period last summer, on our draft state water plan, we compile it all, still have to draft a whole other document. Our board adopted the 2022 state water plan last July. And then each time we complete a planning cycle, we're assessing to determine any lessons learned and receive input from our stakeholders on potential improvements for the next planning cycle. And we held a technical stakeholder meeting last fall to receive such feedback. And right now we're at the beginning of the planning cycle to develop the 2026 regional water plans. And we're conducting our initial analyses to develop the draft water demand projections. So I've included a couple of links on this slide to point you towards places on our website where you can further explore some information. That first link of the second bullet, that's our interactive state water plan. And the second link on the bottom there, it's a dashboard comparing reported historic use to past state water plan demand projections I'll show an image of that later in the presentation. Okay, so that's an overview of how we developed the state water plan. I was going to get into how groundwater availability is determined as a statewide process and then utilized in the planning process. So in 2001, Senate Bill 2 passed, and that moved the responsibility for creating groundwater management areas from the TCEQ over to the Water Development Board, and directed the board to create groundwater management areas for all of the state's major and minor aquifers by September 1st, 2003. So the board, through stakeholder input, created 16 groundwater management areas covering the entire state using aquifers and other hydrological boundaries that primarily honored the designated major aquifers in Texas. Senate Bill 2 also required that groundwater conservation districts within their respective groundwater management areas share management plans with each other and participate in joint planning on a voluntary basis. These conservation districts could also undertake joint studies and research or projects. So, this map here, it looks like a patchwork quilt, basically, each of those being a groundwater conservation district in the state. So they had management authority over the same source. So the intent was you guys get together, share your plans of how you intend to manage this resource. And so the areas with multiple major aquifers, the Water Development Board generally placed a preference on the shallowest aquifer. So, each of these management areas have multiple aquifers that are being managed. The agency divided several of the major aquifers into multiple groundwater management areas, such as the Carrizo-Wilcox, that's in GMA 11, 12, and 13 on the Gulf Coast, and GMA 14, 15, 16 along the coast there, and then the Ogallala split into GMAs 1 and 2. These divisions, again, are based on hydrogeology and current water use patterns and coincided with natural features where possible. Also, where possible, we aligned boundaries with county and existing groundwater conservation districts. So that's the process statewide. They're charged with determining how to manage groundwater. What this looks like is they're setting policy of how that management will happen. And so they're establishing what are called desired future conditions, which I'll get into next. And then once that policy decision comes out of the joint planning process, groundwater availability models are applied to those conditional statements to quantify what is groundwater availability that's then used in regional and state water planning and groundwater management plans. So desired future conditions, or DFCs, if I default to an acronym. Setting groundwater management policy of an aquifer's desired future condition is the goal of the joint planning process. And it's basically an agreed upon condition of which future aquifer conditions will be managed by multiple groundwater conservation districts. And some examples of the policy goals that these groundwater management areas may set are here. Drawdown, which is the majority of the DFCs across the state based upon levels of drawdown. A few of them have spring flow conditions. So think about, on the Edwards Aquifer, and I'm totally forgetting the name of the spring, but that's there's a trigger spring flow event, how that water is managed. And then storage volume. So in the High Plains, the Ogallala, that's a planned depletion. And so their desired future condition is set upon the acceptable level of storage over 50 years. I've also put a link here. So they're updating these every 5 years as well. It's not on the same timing cycle as the regional and state water planning process, but it's a 5-year cycle. That link at the bottom of this slide is where you can go and explore. It's divvied up by groundwater management area, and you can find all the information you'd ever want to know about the DFC process. And the water code that requires that these 9 factors be considered during the development of the desired future conditions. Also required is that the proposed future condition provide a balance between the highest practicable groundwater production and the conservation, preservation, protection, recharging, and prevention of waste of groundwater and control of subsidence. So there's a really big balancing act going on there. And each groundwater management area documents their consideration of these factors as part of their explanatory report that they submit to the Water Development Board. And once those desired future conditions are adopted, the Water Development Board receives them and acts as the modeling technician in estimating modeled available groundwater volumes. And that's the groundwater availability volumes that are utilized in the management plans. So we're using those desired future conditions to determine a modeled available groundwater value for an aquifer or a part of an aquifer in the groundwater management area. And that value is the volume of groundwater production on an average annual basis that will achieve the desired future condition. So these values are independent of existing pumping permits and may, depending on the aquifer characteristics and how the desired future condition is defined, might include a variety of water types, including brackish groundwater. It's not necessarily all fresh groundwater. So we have modeled available groundwater volumes determined. And those are sometimes called MAGs. It's quite a few acronyms we use in this process. But so this is a timeline of our planning process. So now we're moving into state water planning process, or the development of the regional water plans, that become the state water plan, and how they use the modeled available groundwater. So this first red box, that's the estimated availability of when modeled available groundwater values will be completed. So at the end of last year was the completion of all of these groundwater management areas adopting what they wanted their desired future condition of the aquifers to be. Our agency started receiving those, December of last year, and now they're just systematically modeling those conditional statements to produce water availability volumes. Should be done by the end of this summer. I think right now there's about 4 of the 15 have been completed. So they're working their way through it. The second red box up at the top is the estimated release of the draft irrigation water demand projections to the regional water planning groups. And that is the water demand methodology most directly impacted by modeled available groundwater. And I'll discuss that in a moment here. These draft demands will be released later than some of the other categories of use, just because we're waiting for the completion of modeled available groundwater volumes. So this is really significant up in the High Plains groundwater management areas 1 and 2, the planning regions up there, region A and region O, and groundwater is their primary source. Groundwater from the Ogallala is their primary source of water. So I'll get into that in a little bit, how it impacts their demands. This third red box at the bottom is the estimated timeline for planning groups to assess their water availability and current supplies for their plans. So that generally happens the latter half of this year and the earlier part of next year. And then just to build out the rest of that timeline. So March 2025 is when these planning groups have to have their drafted regional water plans submitted to us. And then October 2025 is when they have their final plans. And then we start making the 2027 state water plan. Okay, so that's how groundwater availability is determined. Now I want to get into a little bit more about how it's utilized directly in the state water plan. When I say state water plan, I mean the regional water plans too. I'm using that interchangeably, but it's the regional water plans that are developed first. So the state water plan by statute must be consistent with desired future conditions, and using modeled available groundwater for the groundwater availability is what defines the regional and state water plans as consistent with the desired future condition. And within the groundwater available, existing supplies are identified, which are those that are legally and physically connected for use. So think about, permits, contracts, infrastructure has to be in place for it to be considered existing supply. Available groundwater remaining could potentially be used in future groundwater strategies or projects. And so as I previously discussed, a fundamental step in planning is identifying water supply surpluses or needs. And in the development of water demand projections, groundwater availability plays a role in the irrigation category, which we're going to look at right now. So our agency, every year we develop annual irrigation water use estimates, and those are done at the county level by applying a calculated evapotranspiration based crop water need estimate to reported irrigation acreage from the Farm Service Agency. And these estimates are then adjusted based on surface water release data from TCEQ and comments from groundwater conservation districts and irrigation districts and river authorities. And once modeled available groundwater is completed this summer, we will then draft irrigation demand projections. So projecting forward in the 50-year horizon, which this next plan is going to be 2030 to 2080. And the baseline will be the average of the most recent 5 years of reported of these estimates, so 2015 to 19. And that will be held constant for the 50-year planning horizon, except for in counties where the total groundwater availability over the planning period is projected to be less than the groundwater portion of the baseline demands. And so that irrigation water demand projection will then begin to decline, commensurate with the groundwater availability for that MAG. So in the 2022 state water plan, irrigation demand is more than half of statewide projected water demand and declines over the planning period, mostly due to declining availability in the Ogallala aquifer. So I'm going to show you a visual of what I'm talking about here. So it was important to us to have a methodology of irrigation demands that was reflective of the required groundwater management policies in the state. This is a hypothetical illustration of how this demand methodology aligns with the desired future condition process. So the modeled available groundwater volume is the green curve at the bottom. And the irrigation demand is the blue curve that follows that availability trend. So rather than being held constant, like I mentioned, you know, in a water demand makeup that's mostly surface water, we would just hold that straight across the planning horizon. But when you have a strong groundwater influence that makes up the majority component of your demand, it is groundwater constrained and follows the curve of that availability. So the demand projections are constant volume above the reference groundwater availability volumes, making a buffer that's intended to address unknowns such as the differences between pumping values used in groundwater models and our historic irrigation water use estimates, to compensate for any variations between wet year and dry year pumping, and to compensate for the scale of irrigation water needs and groundwater resource constrained areas that we know can be and are being met through recommended conservation water management strategies. So irrigation practices, land leveling, crop technologies, things such as that. Okay, so this is provided so you can see the pattern of groundwater availability that is imposed upon statewide irrigation demand projections. And this is a static illustration from that dynamic historic use plan comparison tool I mentioned earlier. This depicts irrigation for all regions, so it's statewide, and it shows how our projections really haven't changed that dramatically for the irrigation category. You know, they're constantly showing a steady downward long-term trend. But if you look at the blue line, hopefully you can distinguish between the blue and the gray there, I mean the green, you can see how even at a statewide level, there's the imprint of the groundwater constraint in those 2022 projections. So after the first decade, it does indeed start to dip down and decline. I guess I'll orient you as well. You know, I really encourage folks to use this tool. It's very insightful. The black line up there on the left, those are our annual irrigation water use estimates. So, and we in this dynamic tool with that link in the earlier slide, it's for every category of use. We have it up there. So if there's mining or livestock, municipal, it's all there, and it's all compared to what has actually been reported as historic. So I was also going to take this opportunity to give an overview of another demand category that I thought might be of interest to the audience, and that's mining water use. Mining water use in Texas includes oil and gas activity, sand and gravel or aggregate development, lignite, and other localized mines such as silver and uranium. So there's a lot covered in that category. So our agency develops draft demand projections for this category of use as well. And it's tricky because there's not a lot of publicly available information. You know, we survey aggregate facilities. We look at, in our annual estimates, we look at frac focus. That's the best source of data we have for some sources in the oil and gas sector of use. But this slide summarizes the source data and methodologies used across 3 planning cycles. For the 2017 State Water Plan, we had contracted a study with the Bureau of Economic Geology to gather water use volumes and trends in the mining sector. With future trends and draft projections, those were based upon trends in oil and gas production, but also in land development of mining and oil and gas sites. And then for the most recent, this 2022 State Water Plan that's out there now, those 2017 projections were utilized as the draft starting point, but then we were reliant upon planning groups to bring to us local information available on water sources that were utilized in those activities or any changes in production substantiated that would support their revision requests. And for the planning cycle that we're just now starting, we've again contracted with the Bureau of Economic Geology to evaluate mining water use and sources with funds from the USGS. And this link on the right hand there, that'll take you to the study information page. It's an ongoing study, should have a draft done by next month and should wrap up this summer. But if you want more information about it, feel free to check it out. Determining the base year for this upcoming plan will be a similar approach to past plans. We'll be using information from the BEG, which relies upon our agency's annual water use estimates and water use reports from TCEQ and research that the BEG has done on produced water. Projection trends will also rely on similar sources of information, such as oil and gas production, land development and place-specific trends related to drilling wells, useful life of mines for coal and lignite mining productions, and aggregate production water use will be a function of population projections. So just development of roads and houses. The study is expected to conclude this summer, like I said, and we'll be sending those projections out to planning groups at the end of the summer. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a look at a high-level summary of some of the results from the 2022 State Water Plan. So the very first step in our planning process is to estimate how many Texans there will be. In this slide, the purple lines show the historical population growth in the state from 1850 to 2010, and the yellow lines are the projected population in the State Water Plan. So again, that planning horizon was 2020 to 2070. And over that planning horizon, population is projected to increase by 21.8 million people, or at a growth rate of 73%. Over 60% of all the statewide population growth between 2020 and 2070 is projected to occur within the regions containing the Dallas, Houston, and Austin metroplexes, with the high growth rate counties largely located along the I-35 and I-45 corridors. So our preliminary look at recent census data seems to indicate that we probably under-projected the urban areas and over-projected the rural areas. And right now we're still waiting for the full release of the county projection data from the Texas Demographic Center. So we won't be putting together our population projections or municipal demand projections until the end of this year, going into next year. All right, so on the left of the slide is a chart of the 2022 State Water Plan groundwater availability over the 50-year horizon. That's the dashed yellow curve. And the blue solid line shows the connected existing supplies. The annual statewide groundwater availability in 2020 was estimated to be about 14.2 million acre feet. So that blue line, it's existing groundwater supplies. More than half of that is coming from the Ogallala and Gulf Coast aquifers. And then on the right of this slide is a map showing the county level changes in the 2020 groundwater availability. So the 2020 decade groundwater availability, it's showing the difference between the 2017 and 2022 state water plans. The darkest blue on this map is showing counties that had a greater than a 50% increase in groundwater availability. And that grades down to the darkest of red, which is a greater than 50% decrease in groundwater availability between those plans. These changes are attributed to changes in groundwater management decisions from that joint planning process and or groundwater model updates, because those are going on in the background as well. These changes in groundwater availability impact groundwater supplies, which can impact water supply needs based upon changes to supplies and demands. And that also impacts the amount of groundwater available for future groundwater development. And I give this as an example to show that there's not often one single factor that allows for simple comparisons between two plans. It's wholly unsatisfactory for folks because they want to know the singular reason why things are the way they are. So there's lots of dependencies in these plans, and it makes it really challenging to compare two plans, much less, further back from that. This is a figure, so it's in chapter 5 of the state water plan. In yellow, it's the groundwater availability for the aquifers that have greater than 50,000 acre feet of availability. So mostly the major aquifers of the state. And then in blue, that's the existing supply by aquifer. So what you see for indirectly as a difference between those two is the amount of water, groundwater that's available for future development. And I'll point out, although it didn't make it into the slide, so you'll see an asterisk on 3 of these names here. That denotes aquifer combinations reflecting specific groundwater management policy decisions based upon the properties of those aquifers. So essentially, there were some source name changes between the 2017 and 22 state water plans due to decisions made in the groundwater management process. And hopefully you can see this, but the Ogallala up there at the top, that definitely has the most significant amount of water available for future development, all the way down to the Hickory. I think, Perry, you were talking about looking at the Dockham, so that's on there. And this next slide, I'll jump ahead again. So this is for the aquifers with availability of less than 50,000 acre feet. So essentially the minor aquifers of the state. Same thing, yellow or gold color being the availability, blue being the existing connected supply. And you can see that the Capitan Reef Complex has the largest volume of water available for future use, all the way down to Pecos Valley. That's kind of a challenging thing to read. I guess I will point out too, in the state water plan itself, all this information is tabulated. So if you want to do a numerical comparison, might be easier to see those lower supply volumes. Okay, so how much water do we have and how much will we need? This slide is in millions of acre feet on the y-axis. X-axis is the planning decades across the planning horizon. This is a statewide aggregated graph of water demands and supplies. So water demand is projected to increase by 9% to a total of 19.2 million acre feet per year in 2070. Of that, municipal demand is projected to grow the most over time, from 5.2 to 8.5 million acre feet. So these projected demands are about 10% lower in 2070 than they were in the 2017 state water plan. And that's primarily due to methodological changes we had in our manufacturing and power generation sectors. The last plan, we revised those methodologies to align more closely with reported historic use. Existing water supplies are characterized as physically and legally available surface water, groundwater, and reuse water volumes. The total projected supplies are projected to decrease about 18% over the planning horizon. Existing groundwater supplies are projected to decrease 32%, primarily in the Ogallala and Gulf Coast aquifers. This decrease in groundwater availability is less than that projected over the planning horizon in the 2017 plan, primarily again due to policy decisions through the joint planning process. Existing surface water supplies are projected to decrease about 2%, from 7.2 million acre feet per year in 2020 to 7.1 million acre feet in 2070. And that's primarily due to sedimentation in reservoirs and changes in water supply contracts. Total annual reuse makes up about 4% of the total supplies in the state in 2020. And approximately half of the supply is occurring in Region C, which is the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Reuse supplies are estimated to increase statewide about 15% from 2020 to 2070. However, not all water is available to all users across the state, and that's really masked when you present aggregated statewide results such as this. So in this next slide, we'll look and see where there are actually water supply needs existing. In the event that a severe drought should repeat, the state could face an immediate need shown in the 2020 decade here for additional supplies of about 3.1 million acre feet per year. So these columns are stacked in accordance with the legend on the left there, the largest blue color being irrigation water supply needs. Red on top of that is municipal need. And in 2020, you see municipal need is only about 7% of total need, and irrigation is dominating water supply needs in the state. But total projected needs, our total needs are projected to increase about 6.9 million acre feet per year by 2070. And 3.1 million of that will be municipal needs, or 45% of the total need. These total needs in 2070 are about 25% lower than the last plan. Again, this is due to methodological changes in the demands and also adjustments to water availability, as I've discussed. If you look more closely at the water needs by user type, you can see that while the needs of all water use categories increase, municipal needs grow the most and the fastest, as they are directly tied to population growth. Irrigation demand in the blue at the bottom is driven by groundwater availability, which decreases over time and in accordance with desired future conditions. So again, you can kind of see that shape of declining water availability. So much of the needs that we just looked at, they're anticipated to be addressed through managing water demand, mostly through conservation, which is it's meant to be light green. It's the bottom color of this stacked column. It represents about 30% of strategy supplies in 2070 through demand reduction, although this varies by each of the regions across the state and by the entity. There's about 5,800 recommended strategies in the plan, and they meet most of the potential shortages, especially for municipal users. But there were at least some unmet needs in all water use categories. And again, irrigation represents the vast majority of those unmet needs at about 94% across all decades, because the planning groups, they just did not identify economically feasible ways by which irrigation water supplies could be met. Strategies recommended by regional water planning groups would provide, if implemented, 7.7 million acre feet per year in additional water supplies by 2070. And so I've highlighted that with a red circle on this slide, and we'll break that down further in the next slide. So of that 7.7 million acre feet recommended to be developed, this slide just shows the relative shares of that volume by type of strategy. So that means it's a mixture of the water source and the technology and the infrastructure that's put into place to get that water. Again, the green or the really light color in here is demand management, and blue is new water supply development. And these were the volumes that are assigned directly to each of the discrete entities in the plan to address their needs. And you can see that demand Management here is broken out by different types of conservation, but also by drought management. And these general and relative proportions are similar to those in the 2017 plan. So from largest to smallest, up at the top, you see other surface water is the largest single share at about 25%. When we say other surface water, we're talking about just connecting to existing surface water sources or expanding infrastructure that is already connected. So you can think like water treatment plant expansion or transmission pipelines to existing reservoirs. Agricultural conservation that's dominantly irrigation conservation, but there is a small amount of livestock conservation as well grouped with that. Municipal conservation is about 13% of the share of recommended strategies in 2070. And there are 23 new major reservoirs recommended in this plan, and some of those rely upon indirect reuse as a source of supply. Reuse, both direct and indirect combined, is about 14% of the strategy share, similar to the composition of the last plan, but direct potable reuse has decreased slightly in 2070 from the 2017 State Water Plan. So groundwater development behind other surface water has the largest number of water user groups dependent upon this strategy type. So I think, a lot of the smaller rural communities in the state, they definitely depend upon groundwater development to address their water supply needs. Aquifer storage and recovery, while that's a relatively small share, it's definitely the recommended volume from it has increased quite a bit since the last plan. I guess I'll throw in here too that a new requirement from the legislature for these planning groups in this plan was they had to document consideration of aquifer storage and recovery to address what they identified as significant needs. So there's a discrete section of the State Water Plan that talks about that analysis. And also that same bill, actually a separate bill required from the same session required our agency to develop a aquifer storage and recovery assessment tool, which is available on our website. And they're currently doing specific assessments for certain aquifer storage and recovery projects that are recommended in the 2022 State Water Plan. Sorry, I don't have a separate slide about that. Barry, I know that was area of interest for you, but y'all feel free to contact me and I can direct you to information on that. Lastly, desalination strategies. So seawater and groundwater desalination have collectively increased in volume from the last plan, but are still smaller contributors to the overall recommended portfolio compared to other strategy types. All right, and so in closing, I'm showing you a static image of our interactive State Water Plan, and again, we'll pitch that link to you. It's a really useful tool. You can explore every facet that I discussed in this presentation at geographic intervals, from statewide to planning region to county to down to the entity level. Also on our website, on the State Water Plan page itself, there's several auxiliary documents, maps of major reservoirs that are recommended, policy recommendation summaries, conservation goals set for all the municipal users across the state. So there's a lot of information, and I'm very happy to help anybody navigate our website resources to find information if they are interested. So with that, John, I'm happy to take any questions from folks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So with the State Water Plan, are there any requirements like the desired future conditions, like say a small town, for example? Are there any requirements for them to develop that as part of their strategy when they're looking forward to the future water supplies? Do they have to incorporate those goals into their plans?
Well, yeah, and that's simply done by using that modeled available groundwater volume.
Okay.
So once our agency calculates those volumes, that is the groundwater availability that's utilized by those regional water planning groups. So when they have that availability, whatever they determine to be their existing groundwater supplies and whatever they're recommending for future groundwater strategies, it cannot exceed that modeled available groundwater volume
Okay.
Do we have any more questions?
Probably, but it's a lot of information all there.
It is. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to ask Temple, are these 23 new reservoirs, are any of them giant things like Lake Travis and so on, or are they mostly smaller than that?
Some of them are pretty significant in size. John, I should know the yield of Lake Travis. I can't give you a direct comparative, but yeah, there's a reservoir in the northeastern portion of the state that is on scale with Lake Travis, probably a little bit smaller. It's projected, it was recommended to come online in 2050 though. So it's out in the planning horizon a bit, because those projects do take a while to develop. A major, I guess I'll define this. So a major reservoir is anything that's greater than 5,000 acre-feet of conservation storage volume. Lake Travis is many orders of magnitude larger than that.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, John, I've got a,
Hi, Eric.
hi, John. Coming from Colorado, what kind of strategies are the municipal entities looking at to reduce water use?
There's a lot of conservation in this plan. And so the cost of this plan, if everything recommended was implemented, it's about $80 billion. I think about 10% of that is associated with conservation projects. There's a lot of line replacement, metering programs. Those are the hard infrastructure types. There's also just the general municipal conservation programs, softer costs, not the hard capital costs type programs. A couple of regions in the state actually have recommended drought management. So, conservation's more going on in the background all the time. Drought management in certain areas, they've put that in there as just more restrictive reduction in water use. Reuse programs, those are happening, like I was saying, up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There's a lot of reuse, direct and indirect reuse going on. So a lot of folks consider that a conservation best practice. We, in our plan, we separate the data between conservation and reuse, but I know reuse is considered a demand reduction in some plans. But there's a significant amount for sure.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like the water district has many teeth to halt over water and use, especially in the outdoor. I see water going down the street all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they call out, specific best management practices or BMPs and whatever their conservation strategies are. A lot of folks have outdoor watering ordinances as part of that. They have to quantify the water saved through the practices they're recommending. And so there's several conservation tools available for them, national tools, but also tools on our website that folks can use to estimate quantifying what those practices will provide. But it is very hard to assess the implementation of conservation programs. It's not as simple as metering the well that you just installed to produce new water supply. You've quantified what it is that's producing. Conservation is a little bit trickier to assess its implementation.
So I was wondering how much, if there are cost estimates associated with these items, what's the cost of desalination projected to be in this plan?
Well, I don't know if I have that by category. I'd be really happy to get, I do have it. Hold on, I'm looking at my plan here. I don't have a slide of it. We have unit costs by strategy type in chapter 7 of the state water plan. So weighted average unit cost of seawater desalination is about $1,200 per acre foot. I don't have a total sum cost for you, John, but I'll just
Okay.
give you an example. So about $1,200 versus the unit cost of agricultural conservation statewide is about $180. Or the cost of, let's look at groundwater development is about $400 an acre foot. Unit cost of groundwater desalination statewide is about $1,000 an acre foot. So maybe that gives you a range.
Yeah, very interesting. So it's cheaper to desalinize groundwater. I suppose it's less salty on average.
Yeah, statewide. I mean, keep in mind that it's, you're aggregating a lot of data to get that unit cost. In some regions, it might be cheaper, but that's probably dependent upon the depth of the water and the water quality that they're actually treating.
So what exactly does reuse mean in this plan? What sort of things are covered by that term?
There's some direct potable reuse projects that are recommended. A lot of it in manufacturing. There's reuse of water, but there's some like it's an online project now, and I want to say the San Angelo area. Not San Angelo, it's the Colorado River Municipal Water District. They have a direct reuse project online. So there's examples of it out there. Wichita Falls had a recommended project online for direct reuse, but they turned it into an indirect reuse project. So direct reuse is within the system itself, treating it to a higher level and putting it back in the system. Indirect reuse, your finished water is going into a surface water source, getting abated down the water course, and then picked up further downstream.
That's interesting. So wastewater going through the sewage works and straight back into the pipes.
Yep.
Interesting. Yep. So anybody else have any questions?
Quick question. Are there any indirect reuse, like for wastewater and then treating that and using it to recharge the aquifer?
There is. I'm not going to be able to answer it precisely for you, period, but there are several aquifer storage and recovery projects in here with varying sources of supply. I know at least one of them, the supply that's being utilized in that ASR project is reuse.
Okay. I just wonder what level they had to treat that to be able to inject it into the aquifer, basically back to drinking water standards? Or?
Yeah, essentially, plus you got to deal with some geochemical analyses to the
right.
source water. I mean, the receiving waters.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure we have any more questions, and we're nearly out of time.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Kristen?
With the towards the beginning with the voting versus non-voting groups, I was wondering, are councils of government involved in that process?
There are, we have, I want to say 3 councils of government administer the process for the planning groups in the state. So up in the Panhandle, the Panhandle Regional Planning Council, they, run the meetings, and so they're involved and they're answering questions. I don't know if we have any that are voting members, but it's all a public process. So I should say anybody that's interested whatsoever can attend these meetings and provide information. And in fact, each planning group's required to hold pre-planning public meetings to basically just say, hey, public, what is it we need to be considering this time that we didn't last time? So yeah, the COG in the Panhandle, there's a COG out near El Paso, and then another one that I'm totally forgetting, maybe down in the valley.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You bet. And I'll say too, the North Central Texas COG in the Dallas area, they participate quite a bit, and it's really useful when we're looking at population projections, because they're studying such things at a scale, and in the Houston area, they bring their information to the table regardless if they're a voting member or not.
Time for one last question. Anybody? Nope. All right. Thank you very much, Temple. That
Sure
I found
thing.
a very, very interesting talk. And for me, a rare insight into how Texas government works. Never having worked for or with government. But thanks very much indeed.
You bet.
We'll look
Thank
for-
you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thanks. It's really nice getting to talk with you all this evening. So have a good evening.